I recently moved into my late mother's house, and after settling down, I noticed my mail wasn't arriving. When I checked the surveillance camera, I saw my neighbor stealing it. The next morning, I caught him red-handed, and shortly after, he suddenly disappeared. The letter I finally received revealed part of the mystery. After my mother passed away, I moved into her house, a quaint place with a lovingly tended garden. Settling in, I unpacked boxes filled with memories, but the house felt empty without her. I found comfort in her old belongings, the photos, the books she loved, and the scent of her favorite perfume that still lingered in the air. It was a bittersweet feeling to be surrounded by so much of her, yet feel her absence so strongly. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed something odd. Days had passed without any mail. At first, I thought it was due to the address change, but weeks went by and still nothing. No bills, no flyers, nothing. It felt eerie, like I was cut off from the outside world. I told myself it was just a postal delay, but deep down, a sense of unease started to creep in. Determined to solve the mystery, I installed a small surveillance camera near the mailbox. It was a tiny, discreet device nestled among the flowers, making me feel like a detective in one of my mother's beloved mystery novels. The camera gave me a sense of control over the situation. I was ready to catch whoever, or whatever, was causing this strange disruption. The very next day, I eagerly reviewed the footage. My heart pounded as I watched the screen, fast-forwarding through hours of uneventful recordings. Then, suddenly, there he was, my new neighbor, casually stealing my mail. My jaw dropped. He was a tall, grumpy-looking man who kept to himself. I had only seen him a few times, and he never seemed friendly. He lived in the house next door, which had been vacant for years until he moved in recently. But stealing mail? That was bizarre. I replayed the footage to be sure. There was no mistake. He had my letters in his hands, stuffing them into his coat pockets, his expression calm and indifferent, as if he was performing a routine task. My mind raced with questions. Why would he do that? What could he possibly gain from it? And more importantly, what was he hiding? The next morning, I gathered my courage and walked over to Mr. Thompson's house. I knocked on the door, my heart thudding in my chest. After a moment, it creaked open. Mr. Thompson stood there, looking annoyed, his brows furrowed deeply. He was taller up close, his frame imposing, but there was something in his eyes, something tired, almost haunted. "What do you want?" he grumbled, not even trying to hide his irritation. "Mr. Thompson, I need to talk to you about something important," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've noticed my mail has been missing lately." He narrowed his eyes. "Mail? Missing?" He shook his head dismissively. "You must be mistaken. Probably the post office's fault." I frowned. "Actually, I installed a camera near my mailbox." I paused for effect. "It recorded you taking my mail." Mr. Thompson's face turned red. "That's ridiculous. Why would I take your mail?" His voice rose, defensive. He also tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced, nervous even. "Maybe it's a mistake. You know, cameras can be tricky," he added quickly, his eyes darting to the side. I glanced past him and noticed how empty his house was. Bare walls, no furniture, just a few scattered boxes. It was as if he had just moved in, or maybe he was preparing to leave. "You don't seem to have much here," I said, changing the subject slightly. "Moving in or out?" Mr. Thompson's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. "Just downsizing," he muttered. "Downsizing, huh?" I echoed. "Doesn't look like you ever moved in." He sighed heavily, his frustration evident. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but I didn't take your mail." His evasive answers and strange behavior only increased my suspicions. I knew he was hiding something, and I was ready to find out what. As I walked back to my house, I resolved to catch him red-handed the next morning. This mystery was far from over. I woke up early the following day, determined to intercept the mailman. As I approached the mailbox, my heart beat faster. The early morning fog swirled around me, adding an eerie atmosphere to the already tense situation. I saw Mr. Thompson heading toward the mailbox, too. He was wearing his usual old coat and glasses, looking as grumpy as ever. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was thinking through every step he took. When he saw me standing there, holding a letter, he froze. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like a deer caught in headlights. There was a flicker of something in his expression, panic, maybe guilt. Then, without a word, he hurried back to his house, almost tripping over his own feet. The speed with which he moved was unsettling, as if he was running from something much bigger than just a confrontation with me. "Mr. Thompson!" I called out, but he ignored me, disappearing through his front door and slamming it shut behind him with a loud bang. I looked down at the letter in my hands. It was a big white envelope addressed to my mother. My heart skipped a beat. Why was mail still arriving for her? With trembling fingers, I carefully opened it. Inside was a letter from my estranged father. "Dearest Clara, I never tire of writing to you. You know I've sent hundreds of letters in my life, and many more are on automated delivery. They will reach you for the rest of your life. I'm ashamed of how things turned out, but I beg you once more, tell our daughter Diana about me. I'll never have the courage to speak to her after everything, but she must know that I love her. I am sorry, Jack." I read the letter again, my mind reeling. This was no ordinary stolen mail. This was a letter from the father I had never known, the man who had abandoned us years ago, the man my mother had never spoken about except to say he was gone. Why was Mr. Thompson intercepting these letters? What was he hiding? My father had clearly been sending letters for years, yet this was the first one I had ever seen. How many more had been stolen? The situation was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. I knew I had to confront Mr. Thompson again, but this time I needed answers. Without wasting any time, I walked over to his house, my hands still trembling with the weight of the revelation. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The eerie silence around the house was unsettling. After a few more knocks, I decided to try the handle. To my surprise, the door creaked open. I found myself inside his dimly lit living room. It was nearly empty, with just a few pieces of furniture scattered around. The air was thick with dust, as if no one had truly lived there for a long time. It felt like a place where time had stood still, forgotten, and abandoned. Everything looked like it had been left in a hurry. Things were thrown on the floor, and papers were strewn across the table. A thick layer of dust covered everything, making it clear that he had been planning to leave for a while. "Mr. Thompson?" I called out, but only silence answered me. Walking further into the house, I noticed a photo on the floor in a dark corner. It was slightly crumpled, as if it had been stepped on. Picking it up, I saw a picture of a woman and two children smiling happily. The back of the photo had a worn address scribbled, almost fading with time. I squinted to make out the address. It was a place I didn't recognize, but it looked important, like a clue leading me deeper into the mystery. This must be where he went, I thought aloud. Without hesitation, I put some snacks in my lunchbox at home, grabbed a bottle of water, and started my car. The drive felt like it took forever. The road stretched endlessly before me, my mind racing with questions. Who was Mr. Thompson, and what did he have to do with my father? The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together, but the full picture was still unclear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something much larger than I had anticipated. As I drove, the landscape began to change. The houses became fewer, the streets quieter, and soon I found myself in a more rural area. The address on the back of the photo led me to a modest house with a well-tended garden. Children played in the yard, their laughter filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the tension I felt inside. As I approached, the children paused their game and looked at me curiously. Their wide, innocent eyes seemed to pierce through me, as if they knew I didn't belong. Taking a deep breath, I walked up to the porch and knocked on the door. My hand shook slightly as I rapped on the wood, but I stood firm, determined to get the answers I had been seeking. It opened to reveal a woman my age. She bore a striking resemblance to me. Same brown eyes, same wavy hair. It was like looking into a mirror, a surreal moment that sent a chill down my spine. "Hello," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm Diana." She frowned slightly but extended her hand. "Hi, I'm Emily. Can I help you with something?" "I'm looking for Mr. Thompson," I replied. "He's my father," Emily said, her frown deepening. "Why are you looking for him?" Before I could answer, Mr. Thompson appeared behind her. His eyes widened in shock when he saw me. His reaction was almost immediate, his face draining of color as though he had seen a ghost. "Diana," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his face turning pale as the realization hit him. There was a tremor in his voice, and he glanced nervously between me and Emily. "Dad, who is she?" Emily asked, looking between us, Mr. Thompson or Jack. seemed to struggle for words. His hands shook as he tried to collect his thoughts, his expression a mixture of fear and shame. I can explain," he stammered, but before he could continue, Emily cut him off. The children stopped playing and watched us from the yard, sensing that something important was happening. Mr. Thompson took a step forward, his eyes pleading, "Diana, you are my daughter. Emily, Diana is your sister." The words hung in the air, heavy with shock. It was as if time had stopped for a moment. Emily stared at her father, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief, while I stood there, frozen, trying to comprehend the bombshell that had just been dropped. "What?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, a mixture of confusion and betrayal lacing her tone. Mr. Thompson nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. He looked at me, his face etched with guilt and regret, before turning to Emily. "Diana is my daughter, from a relationship long before I met your mother. I left her mother before she was born and didn't know about her until years later." I felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, and a strange sense of relief. This man, who had been my neighbor, was actually my father. All those years, growing up without knowing who he was, and now here he was standing in front of me, revealing a truth I had never expected. "You knew about me all this time?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. Mr. Thompson, or rather Jack, looked at me with tear-filled eyes. He nodded, his hands trembling at his sides. "Yes, Diana. I found out about you when you started school. I didn't know how to tell you. I set up an automated mailing system to send letters to your mother out of guilt. But after she died and you moved into her house, I got scared. I rented the house next door to keep an eye on you, to protect the secret. I didn't want to disrupt your life." Emily took a step back, her face pale. The betrayal was written all over her expression, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. She had grown up believing one story, only to have it shattered in an instant. "So you've been spying on her? Stealing her mail?" "Why, Dad?" Emily's voice wavered with anger and confusion. "I know it was wrong," Jack admitted, his voice low, filled with regret. "I thought I was protecting you both. I didn't want to lose everything. I thought if I could just keep you both safe, maybe I could make amends for my mistakes." I sat on the grass, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. This was too much to take in all at once. The father I had never known, the sister I never knew I had, and the web of lies and secrets that had kept us apart for so long. I grew up without a father, and now I find out he was living next door all this time, I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Jack sighed deeply, the weight of his mistakes heavy on his shoulders. "I was ashamed. I thought you would hate me. I thought it was better to stay hidden, to keep my distance." Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with determination. "This is a lot to take in," she said, her eyes flicking between Jack and me. "But we can figure this out together. We have to." I looked at her, then at Jack. I didn't know how to feel, anger, sadness, hope, but I knew one thing. I wanted to try. I wanted to understand everything and see where we could go from here. Jack's face softened with relief, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Diana. I want to be a part of your life if you'll let me." As we stood there, the tension in the air slowly began to dissipate. Emily smiled through her tears, a tentative but hopeful expression on her face. "Let's start by introducing you to the rest of the family," she said, gesturing towards the children playing in the backyard. There was a warmth in her voice, an openness that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, this could work. Emily introduced me to her kids, my nieces and nephews, and I couldn't help but smile at their innocent curiosity. Their wide-eyed wonder made the heavy atmosphere feel lighter, their laughter a welcome relief from the emotional storm we had just weathered. "Hi, I'm Diana," I said, kneeling to their level. "I'm your aunt." They looked at each other, then back at me with wide grins. "Cool," one of them said, and the others nodded in agreement, their childish enthusiasm infectious. It was such a simple word, but in that moment it felt like a bridge, one that spanned the years of distance and unspoken truths between us. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was beginning to feel like I belonged. Emily laughed, the tension easing slightly. She turned to me, her expression softer now, and said, "How about we make some barbecue and get to know each other better?" "Sounds great," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something bigger than just myself. Despite everything that had happened, despite the lies and the years of distance, there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this family could heal. As we gathered around the grill, preparing food and sharing stories, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in a long time. Emily worked the grill while Jack, no, Dad, stood by, his expression softening as the moments passed. He was clearly nervous, unsure how to approach this new chapter in our lives, but he was trying. That meant something. "Do you want to help with the cooking?" Emily asked, handing me a spatula. I hesitated for a second, but then nodded, stepping forward. "Sure," I said, taking the spatula from her. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like an invitation into their world, a world that I wasn't sure I had the right to be part of, but one that I was being welcomed into nonetheless. The smell of grilling meat filled the air, mingling with the sounds of children playing and the gentle hum of conversation. I listened as Emily talked about her life, her work, and the kids' antics, all while occasionally glancing at Jack. He stood nearby, mostly silent, but watching us with a mix of emotions, pride, guilt, and relief, all bundled into one complex expression. "I can't believe this is happening," I murmured to Emily as we flipped burgers. "It's like, I didn't even know you existed until today, and now here I am, part of this family." Emily smiled gently. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? I didn't know about you either, but I guess we both have a lot to catch up on." As we continued cooking, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Emily shared funny stories about her kids, how one of them had recently flushed a toy down the toilet, causing a flood in the bathroom. And we both laughed, the tension between us easing with every shared moment. It was strange but comforting how quickly we seemed to fall into a rhythm. The children were still running around, chasing each other in a game of tag. Their laughter echoed through the yard, a sound so innocent and full of life that it made my heart ache with a kind of joy I hadn't expected. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was beginning to see a future, one where I could be part of a family, one where the past didn't have to define everything. Jack, Dad, eventually joined us at the grill. He stood on the other side of the table, hesitating for a moment before he spoke. "I know I've messed up," he began, his voice soft but steady, "and I know it's going to take time. But I want to be part of your life, Diana. I want to try and make up for the time we lost, if you'll let me." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes. He was a man who had made mistakes, big mistakes, but he was here, standing in front of me, asking for a second chance, and something inside me told me to give it to him. "I want that too," I said, my voice just as soft, "but it's going to take time." Jack nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly in relief. "I understand," he said. "I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." The three of us, me, Emily, and Jack, stood there for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between us. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be hard conversations ahead, painful memories to confront, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. I had a sister. I had a father. And that was a start. After we finished cooking, we all sat down at the picnic table in the backyard. The kids had settled down, their energy finally running low as they sat beside us, chattering happily about their day. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the yard and painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was a perfect evening, the kind that felt like a promise of new beginnings. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily. Emily told me more about her life, her career, her hobbies, the things that made her who she was. I found myself smiling more than I had in a long time, the tension in my chest slowly unraveling as the evening went on. Every now and then, I caught Jack watching us, a small, hopeful smile playing on his lips. At one point, Emily excused herself to check on the kids, leaving me and Jack alone at the table. The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable. We sat there for a while, neither of us speaking, both of us lost in our thoughts. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "You remind me of your mother," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You have her eyes, her strength." I looked at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. For so long I had thought of him as this distant, almost mythical figure, someone who had abandoned me and my mother without a second thought. But sitting here, seeing the pain and regret in his eyes, I realized that maybe things weren't as simple as I had always believed. She was an incredible woman, Jack continued, his gaze distant, as if he were lost in a memory. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Diana, but I hope one day you'll understand why I did what I did. I swallowed the lump in my throat, unsure of how to respond. There was so much I still didn't know, so much I needed to process. But for now, all I could do was nod. We'll get there, I said softly, one step at a time. Jack smiled, a small tentative smile, but one filled with hope. And in that moment I knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, we would face it together. As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, we all gathered around the fire pit in the yard. The children roasted marshmallows, their laughter filling the air as they tried to catch the perfect golden brown. Emily sat beside me, her arm casually draped over my shoulder, and for the first time I felt the warmth of a sibling bond. We shared stories, some funny, some sad, but each one brought us closer. Jack stayed quiet for most of the evening, but every now and then he would chime in with a memory of my mother, his eyes softening with nostalgia. By the time the fire had died down and the children had fallen asleep in their makeshift beds of blankets and pillows, I realized that something had shifted inside me. This place, these people, felt like home. As I looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. I had a family now. It was broken and imperfect, but it was mine. And together we would find our way forward.